friends. All right, so today I'm going to tell you guys the story of the robins building their nest. First of all, I want to point out the fact that Zoe is right there, so hi Zoe. All right, so today's story is about the robins building their nest. Now, I know that we heard a story about the robins before, but we heard a story about where they lived when they were not nesting or having or laying eggs in the spring. So this story is going to be about where they go for the spring to build their nest. Now, when the robins were deciding where to build their nest, they were flying around looking for places that they thought would suit their nest. And Mrs. Robin pointed out a place on a fence, a split fence, right between the railings. So there were two railings on it, and she thought that the bottom one would be perfect for it because she decided that if you put the nest underneath the top railing, it would be sheltered from the rain and the wind, but then also it was a good color because the grass that they could find would blend in, and she wanted to make sure that her nest was camouflaged. Now, Mr. Robin decided that they needed to put their nest in the crook of a tree, so right where two tree branches kind of come together. And so he said that that's where he wanted to put the nest. Now, Mrs. Robin pointed out the fact that they could do it in the crook of the tree, but it was going to be hard to find mud to build up in that crook so that they had a flat bottom to put the nest on. But Mr. Robin was very stubborn that this would be the best place. And he even told her, he said, I have the brightest feathers. And in bird families, whoever has the brightest feathers is supposed to be the one that makes all the decisions. So Mrs. Robin just kind of sighed, and then she looked at the ground and she took 10 really quick steps forward and she pulled out her dinner for that night and ate it. And she went back to Mr. Robin and she said, Dear, if you think that the tree is the best place for us to put the nest, that is where we will put the nest. So they decided to fly up into the tree and sleep in that crook of the tree that night, just to, test it out and see. The next morning, before the sun had even totally come up, right when the sun rays were coming through the trees at the very beginning of the morning, they got up nice and early and they started building their nest. Now, the first thing they had to do was go out and find a bunch of mud, because in the crook of this tree there was a big hole, and they couldn't put their nest all the way down in the hole. They needed something flat, so they were going to have to bring a ton of mud over to build it up. So that's what they started with first. But then Mrs. Robin noticed that the mud that they were using was really light colored, and it showed up against the tree. And so she asked Mr. Robin, she said, can't you find any mud that's a little bit darker? Because this is going to be really obvious in the tree. It's going to be hard to camouflage our nest. So Mr. Robin went out to see if he could find some different colored mud that was a little darker. He had a really hard time doing it. He couldn't. So he went back and he told Mrs. Robin, we'll just have to make sure we put the nest over the top of it so you can't see it. And Mrs. Robin just sort of shook her head and agreed and went on building up the mud. Now, up in the sky, there started becoming cloudy, and it looked like it was going to rain. And Mrs. Robin said, boy, I sure hope that we manage to get most of this built before it rains, because the mud is the perfect softness right now. But if it rains, it might get washed away. And Mr. Robin said, oh, I'm sure it'll be fine. It'll be fine. Well, not long after that, it started raining. Big raindrops coming down from the sky and splattering all over the place. And so the Mr. and Mrs. Robin took some oil and they brushed it all over their feathers so that the rain would slide off of them, and they waited out the storm. And as they were doing it, they saw all of the mud that they had been bringing in getting washed out of this tree. Now, after it rained, they shook themselves off and dried themselves off, because it was really easy to do that with the oil that they'd put on their feathers when it started raining. And Mrs. Robin looked at Mr. Robin and said, I think you were right. We should move our nest to where the fence was. Mr. Robin thought for a second. He was like, I don't remember saying that. And he looked at Mrs. Robin and he waited for a minute for her to say something, but it was clear she wasn't going to say anything. So he decided he needed to be the first to speak, and he said, well, if you agree with me, then yes, we probably should move our nest. I don't know why we didn't do it there to begin with. And Mrs. Robin just kind of smiled and agreed with her husband. And so they decided to move their nest to the fence post, or the railing on the fence post, even though Mr. Robin, as hard as he thought about it, really couldn't remember saying that that's where they should put it, but he would take the credit for it. So they started going and gathering different hay and dried grass, and the mud matched perfectly with this railing, and they made pretty quick work of putting this together. And Mr. Robin even thought out loud while they were making it, "I can't believe that no other birds took this spot before we got it." And Miss Robin just... So after they had finished building their nest, and it was nice and beautiful and camouflaged against the fence, Mr. Robin flew off for a little while, and when he returned, he had found this beautiful piece of white thread. And so he put it on the outside of the fence, and he said to Mrs. Robin, he said, "We don't want to brag about what we have, but the outside of the nest just really seems like the best place to put this piece of thread." And Mrs. Robin quite agreed with him and was okay with it. Later on that day, Mrs. Robin went to visit one of her friends, Mrs. Goldfinch, and Mrs. Goldfinch said, "My, it's a beautiful nest that you have on that fence post over there. Isn't that where you wanted to put it?" And Miss Robin said, "Well, we tried the crook of the tree, and then Mr. Robin decided that the fence post would be the best place to put that nest for this year." And she kind of winked at Mrs. Goldfinch, and they both laughed because they knew that having the brightest feathers in the family was not the best reason to be able to make all of the decisions. And that, my friends, is the story of the robins building their nest. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.